Okay, welcome to Module 2 of Reading 16. Here we're going to be talking about currency derivatives, currency swaps, currency futures and forwards. And once again at level 3, focusing on the application rather than on the technical pricing and valuation. So let's remind ourselves what a currency swap is. A currency swap, in essence, gives you the ability to swap one currency for another. The genesis, if you like, of currency swaps, the reason they came into existence is because it allows firms to borrow in one currency that maybe they have a comparative advantage in. In other words, they can get cheap funds. Maybe a UK firm can get cheap sterling, UK sterling, but maybe they actually want dollars. What they can do is they can borrow cheap sterling and swap it through a currency swap for the dollars they actually want. And the key point here is that if the UK firm went directly to a US bank, maybe their comparative advantage wouldn't exist and they'd get charged higher rate of interest for US dollars directly from a US bank than they can get by borrowing cheap sterling and swapping it for dollars through a currency swap. Okay. Now I am assuming here that the principal, the sizes, the sterling amount and the dollar amount are actually exchanged at the start and the end of the swap's life. There are some currency swaps where those notional amounts are not exchanged. And so there's only interest payments along the way. However, if the notional amounts are exchanged at the start and re-exchanged back at the end of the swap's life, this is referred to as a cross-currency basis swap. It's important that the word basis represents a currency swap where principals do change hands. It's important you take that on board. Okay, let's have a look at an example. It'll become a lot clearer when we draw a few boxes of who's doing what here. Here's a euro-based company that needs US dollars. So here's a euro-based company and they want US dollars. Now, it's likely that their comparative advantage is actually in the euro markets. In other words, they're likely to be able to borrow cheap euros, but if they went to a US bank, chances are those funds won't be so cheap. So in order to use a currency swap to take advantage of their comparatively low funds in the euro market, the company actually does borrow cheap euros from a European bank. All right, so some euros do go across. And what they're going to do is they're going to swap those euros out and receive in dollars. So there's a swap dealer over here. Here comes the swap, where the swap dealer passes back some dollars. Okay. Now the key implication here is that when the European company passes these euros over to the swap dealer will agree to pay the interest on those euro funds. In this particular example, it looks like that rate is Euribor, all right, the European interbank offered rate. The European company will agree to pay an interest rate, essentially fund the interest rate on these dollars, which in this example, yes, we've got 90-day Euribor on the euro leg, and the US dollar borrowing is 90-day US dollar LIBOR, all right, so we'll just call that LIBOR, all right, dollar LIBOR. So that's the essence of the swap. Here on the underlying loan, the European company will still be making payments. So let's assume that they funded that at Euribor. So they'll still be making interest payments here on their European loan. But now you can see that they haven't had to go to a US bank. Essentially, they've borrowed euros, where they've got a comparative advantage, swapped them out with a swap dealer who's given back dollars, and then they need to fund each other's currency, essentially. You know, the swap dealer, it's like the swap dealer is borrowing euros and they're paying Euribor to the European company. And it's like, well, this is the whole point of this, the European company gets US dollars, is paying dollar LIBOR, and this Euribor just flows through and cancels out. Now, to put some numbers on this, that's the big picture. Let's put some numbers on this. The company enters into a 2-year, 50 million euro notional cross-currency basis swap. So with a basis swap, the principals actually change hands, as I've been assuming, with quarterly settlement. Now, be careful with that. All rates are quoted annual, you do need to de-annualize them if you're going to use them in a calculation. Now you're given here the US dollar euro exchange rate at initiation is $1.1236 per euro, and you're asked to calculate the payments at each settlement. So the slides are really just listing out the payments that are going to need to be made here. So at the start, because it's a basis swap, they will actually borrow 50 million euros. So that's this bit here. 50 million euros is borrowed and is passed to the swap dealer. Okay, that's that bullet point here. They will receive 50 million euros times 1.1236. That's the exchange rate, that's the number of dollars per euro. All right, so they will receive in return $56.18 million. And that's really the funds, they are the funds that the European company was after in the first place. Now at each settlement, the Euro company pays $56.18 million times quarterly dollar LIBOR to the swap dealer. Yep, we knew that. And they will receive in 50 million euros times quarterly Euribor from the swap dealer. Yep, we knew that as well. Okay. And don't forget they do pay 50 million times quarterly Euribor on the actual bank loan. Okay, so we knew that as well. So I've tried to make them sort of, these are kind of wiggly lines to represent the fact that these interest rates are floating and they're going to move around a little bit. But whatever Euribor is, it comes in under the swap and it goes out under the loan. So the European company is essentially hedged. And they've got dollars and are paying a dollar interest rate. Now let's just put some numbers in here. At maturity, yeah, we swap back because it's a basis swap. At maturity, we do swap back the notional principals. Okay, so this is kind of the reverse of what happened at the start. The company will pay back to the swap dealer the dollars that they essentially borrowed at the outset, and they will get the 50 million euros that they transferred to the swap dealer at the outset. They'll get that back. They'll repay the bank loan, and through this swap, they've essentially converted, as we said, a 50 million euro floating rate obligation into a slightly higher dollar floating rate obligation. Okay, so that's the basic idea here. Now, at this stage in the curriculum, they focus on a disequilibrium that has occurred in swap markets. If you like, I won't call it a mispricing, but it's what's referred to maybe as a dislocation. What's been noticed since the credit crunch of 2008, 2009 is that a key equilibrium metric hasn't held in cross-currency swap markets. The key equilibrium relationship that we're referring to here is covered interest rate parity. Covered interest rate parity is a relationship between interest rates and currency forward rates. We've met it before at previous levels, and the general idea is that under covered interest rate parity, high interest rate currencies trade at a discount. They are weaker in the forward market. This is a no arbitrage law which stops people from depositing in high interest rate currencies, selling it forward and making risk-free gains. You know, when they go to sell high interest rate currencies forward, what they find is the high interest rate currency is a discount, so they don't earn excess returns. Now, the curriculum makes a point that covered interest rate parity has not held in swap markets since the credit crunch of 2008, 2009. The key implication of this we can talk about in a moment, but if covered interest rate parity did hold in swap markets, the major result of that would be non-US companies wanting to get their hands on dollars through swaps. That is, exactly like our European company that we've already looked at. So they borrow domestically and swap out and bring dollars in under a swap. Those companies borrowing dollars synthetically through a swap, they would pay for these US dollars exactly the same as their domestic borrowing costs. In other words, they would fully benefit from their comparative advantage through the swap if covered interest rate parity holds. That's the key takeaway here. The European company, let's just big picture it, this company here, presumably borrowing cheaper in the European markets, if covered interest rate parity holds, which essentially sets margins around these interest rates, if covered interest rate parity holds, then this European company ends up spending exactly what they would have on their domestic funds for these dollars that they've received through this cross-currency swap. What we found, that's if covered interest rate parity holds. That's if it holds. It's an equilibrium relationship, which essentially means, markets there's no arbitrage in markets. But since the credit crunch, what we found is that covered interest rate parity has not held. Since the credit crunch, there has been increases in transaction fees and taxes, market frictions, which stops arbitrageurs from essentially enforcing this equilibrium relationship upon markets. There's also been stricter regulation, capital adequacy controls, and fines for banks for not having adequate capital, which has resulted generally in higher interest costs on funds, which has affected swap markets. But probably most crucially is, since the credit crunch, there's been a very high demand for US dollars. So those non-US companies borrowing dollars through a swap are finding they're having to pay more than what covered interest rate parity would suggest. This is the crucial thing about this breach of covered interest rate parity. What we're finding is these non-US entities, these European companies, are, when they synthetically borrow dollars through a cross-currency swap, they are having to pay more for those dollars than what covered interest rate parity would suggest. And that means they're not getting their full comparative advantage in the domestic market. It means they're giving away some of their comparative advantage. The amount that they're giving away is referred to as the basis. The basis is the incremental cost to non-US firms, think European firms, of synthetically borrowing dollars through a swap versus their domestic borrowing costs. This basis is how much non-US firms are having to pay up above their domestic cost of borrowing to get their hands on dollars through a swap. And really it's to do with the fact that dollars are in demand, essentially, since the credit crunch. Now the basis is expressed in basis points. The way this is applied, don't forget, basis means that the covered interest rate parity doesn't hold, so there's extra cost going on for this participant, that's this non-US participant that is synthetically borrowing dollars. Now you might think, oh, well, we add a margin to this dollar LIBOR that they have to pay, but this is crucial. That's not what happens. What happens is the lender of dollars here, the swap dealer, actually takes off an amount here. They give back less on the non-US funds, in this case euros. So that's why this basis is often expressed as a negative. It's a marking down of what a dollar lender through a swap is willing to pay on non-dollar funds, in this case euros. And it means that this non-US synthetic borrower of dollars is actually having to pay more for the dollars. Not explicitly through a higher dollar rate, but essentially implicitly through a lower interest rate on their non-US funds. Let's have a look at this in action. By the way, this negative basis is exactly what I've just described. It's a mark down, all right? It means that the non-US investor gets less interest on non-US funds, in our example euros, okay? And that, that increases the cost of synthetically borrowing dollars through the swap. All right, let's have a look let's put some numbers into this example to see it in action. All right, so I'm going to rebuild this currency swap setup here. Okay, but this time, what's really been missing from our analysis so far has been the fact that, companies wouldn't necessarily borrow at Euribor and swap, rates at Euribor or dollar LIBOR. There'll be little margins there, and that's where the basis comes in. Let's have a look. So we've got here Boivis or Boivy, a French patisserie, bakery, brackets bakery, which needs $50 million. So it's a very similar setup as before. We've got a European company, and we know that they need dollars. Now, if they go directly to the US markets, they get quoted a prohibitively expensive cost of dollars. So if they go directly to the US market, they'll pay dollar LIBOR plus 100 basis points. That's plus 100, basis points, that's 1%. If they borrow euros, this is a European company, so if they choose to take advantage of their comparative advantage by borrowing euros, they could always borrow some euros and pay back maybe a margin that isn't 100 basis points above the floating rate. So what have we got here? Euribor plus 60. So Euribor plus 60 bips. 0.6% if you like. So the idea is, you know the idea now, to get hold of some cheap dollars, what we'll do is we'll actually borrow some euros, pass those euros over to a swap dealer. Okay, get back the dollars that we want to get our hands on. But we will agree that we will fund this dollar loan. That's the synthetic dollar interest. Well, it's a synthetic dollar borrowing here. Okay, so we're going to pay a dollar interest rate back to the swap dealer, and the swap dealer will pay us back a euro interest rate. Okay. Now we know we want to get our hands on $50 million, but check this out. We know that Boisville will enter into a 4-year variable interest quarterly paid currency swap, and this is very important. There's a basis of minus 20 bips on the euro versus the dollar. What that means is the rate that they're going to get back on their euros is going to be marked down by 20 basis points. All right? Let's make that a bit more of a reasonable colour. That's where basis comes in. Basis comes in because it's going to mark down what they get back on their non-US funds by that amount. 20 basis points is minus 0.2%, of course. That's where basis comes in. Increasing the cost of dollars to a non-US dollar company, a non-US company, through a swap. Now we're told the dollar-euro exchange rate is $1.18 spot 15, or 1 spot 1815. Okay, so that's number of dollars per euro right now. And that exchange rate is going to set how many euros this company is going to borrow in order to get their hands on $50 million. So, they want to get $50 million back here. That's what they want to get back. $50 million, they want that to come back. So, at this exchange rate, that means they need to borrow how many euros? Well, at this exchange rate, now you're given some Euribor and LIBOR rates here. We'll come back to those in a bit. But let's calculate the principal amounts exchanged. We know that the whole point of this is that the European company wants $50 million coming in. At an exchange rate, dollars per euro, of 1.1815, we can now work out how many euros they should borrow and how many euros they need to transfer over to the swap dealer. So let's have a look at the slide doing that for us. At initiation, we need to borrow $50 million divided by the exchange rate of 1 spot 1815. We only need to borrow 42,319,086 euros. Okay, so this is like 40. I'll keep it clean by rounding, but that's 42.3 million, and that's what gets transferred over, 42.3 million. Okay, and that's just using the current spot exchange rate. We're going to swap back principals at maturity. Okay, now here comes the crucial thing. At the first settlement date, we were told that at initiation, 3-month LIBOR is 1.5% and dollar LIBOR is 2%. And then 3 months later, interest rates are slightly different. Now, assuming that we're making payments in arrears, it's these rates that are in place at initiation that will be settled up at the end of the first quarter, at the end of the first 3 months. So the Euribor leg is going to be 1.5%. Okay, the Euribor leg, let's look at the swap. Here's the swap here. The Euribor leg is going to be 1.5% on the euros that have been transferred over. But here comes the big deal. The basis is a markdown of 20 basis points on what the non-US company receives for their non-US funds on the swap. Okay, so they're going to receive some euro interest. We know that much. That's this coming back. All right, they're going to receive 1.5%. That's Euribor for the first period. But there's the basis knocking down how much we actually get. I've made the basis orange in this, so let's stick with that. Okay, 20 basis points. That's the euro amount that we borrowed. We agree with that. And don't forget to de-annualize rates. So this is a quarterly swap. So we'll assume 30, 360 day count for simplicity. That's 90 days out of 360 there. So they're going to receive 137,537 euros in. That's dealt with this payment here. That was the very important one because we got to see the basis in action, lowering that Euribor leg from 1.5% down to essentially 1.3 on an annual basis in that first period. Now they're going to pay their interest on the swap. So this is this payment here. All right, we're talking, these are interest payments because they're, just to be clear. So the dollar interest is going to be $50 million. That's the US dollar size of the swap times 2%. That must be the dollar LIBOR for the first period. That was given to us back here. Yes, it is. Okay, and then we're going to de-annualize that accordingly. So that's $250,000. So we've dealt with this payment. We've dealt with that payment. $250,000, that's the one we just dealt with. Let's deal with this payment. Don't forget they actually borrow at Euribor plus 60 pips. So that's why they're borrowing. There's the loan. Just change the pen colour because now there's the loan. That's the loan. That's your Euribor for the first period. And there's the margin on the loan. Okay? De-annualize it and you get 222,175. So this is all equivalent to borrowing the US dollars at 50 million, paying the 2% dollar LIBOR, also paying the margin, that's your local domestic margin, all right? Let's be clear. Let's call it your domestic. That was the domestic euro margin. And then you can take off the basis. Now, basis being negative increases your cost of US dollars through a swap. So it's actually adding 20 basis points on there. So this is equivalent to paying $350,000 under the swap when we think about it purely from what the European company is paying for these dollars. Okay? You'll notice that they're borrowing here at what dollar LIBOR turned out to be plus 60 basis points minus plus another 20 basis points. So they're actually borrowing at, the dollar LIBOR plus 80 bips. All right, the 60 bips here, which is their domestic margin, and the negative basis is increasing their cost of funds. So hopefully you can see here that their net borrowing, it's higher than their domestic borrowing rate, which is Euribor plus 60, okay, but it's still lower than if they went directly to America, where the borrowing rate was dollar LIBOR plus 1%, not 80 bips, but 1%. Yep. So there's still an advantage here of going through the swap. Even though they're not getting their domestic rate of 60 bips margin, all right, they're actually paying 80 bips margin due to the 20 bips basis. That's still lower than the 100 bips margin that would be added on if they went directly to America. Don't forget that. If they go directly, if this European company went directly to a US bank, they would pay dollar LIBOR plus 100 bips or 1%. Still better than that. Overall here they've got 80 bips in excess of dollar LIBOR. Here they've only got, here they'd have to pay more. So it's still beneficial to go through the swap. Okay, so Yeah, if they went direct to America, they would have paid 100 bips. So that would have been 375. You can do the sums there. Synthetically, they're borrowing LIBOR, dollar LIBOR plus 80 bips. So that is, if you want to quantify it, that is a $25,000 benefit they're getting through these dollars in the swap versus dollars directly. Now, these kind of sums repeat at the second settlement date. You might remember at the second settlement date, interest rates have changed. So at the second settlement date, what we find is that Euribor is now 1.6 and dollar LIBOR is now 1.9. So whilst the rates have changed, the process hasn't. Okay, it's still the case that we'll pay interest on the same euro loan at what Euribor is plus the margin in our domestic market. Okay, de-annualized. It's still the case that under the swap, we will still pay dollar LIBOR de-annualized on $50 million, and it's still the case that under the swap, let's turn the pen orange because we're going to make a comment about basis, that we will receive Euribor, but we have to essentially pay away or give away the basis. Okay, so that's 148 coming in. I'll let you check the numbers, but you know, this is equivalent to paying on our $50 million here. This is equivalent to paying the US dollar LIBOR rate plus the domestic margin. So that's your comparative advantage there, but you are giving up the basis as well. And being a negative basis, when you take it off, it's increasing your cost of funds. So that's 337,500. That's the equivalent. That's essentially what you're paying in dollars. And what you'll find is that's better than what you would have paid if you went directly to the US market. Don't forget, if you went directly to the US market, you'd have paid LIBOR plus 100 bips, and it would have cost you 362,500. Well, we've just said that your net cost was 337,500. That's what we just said on the previous slide, 337,500. And so once again, the difference is that 20 basis point advantage that you're getting. All right? Don't forget that what's happening here is that through the swap, the European company pays essentially dollar LIBOR plus 80 bips. Now that 80 bips is made up of their 60 bips domestic margin, essentially plus the 20 bips negative basis. That is still better than going directly and paying dollar LIBOR plus 100 bips direct. And the net benefit is 20 bips, which happens to be the same number as the basis, but beware. All right, this comparative advantage is not the basis. Don't confuse the two. All right, be very careful with that. This advantage of 20 basis points, which is what we'd pay directly in America versus what we synthetically pay in the swap, that doesn't have to be the basis. The basis is how much more we're paying in the swap versus our domestic costs of funds. If that basis, that penalty, is less than our comparative advantage, which it is here, our comparative advantage originally is actually 40 basis points, isn't it? 60 in domestic markets, 100 in US markets. Our comparative advantage is 40 bips. Basis has eaten away 20 bips of that, which leaves us with a comparative advantage of only 20 now, once we suffer that basis. Okay, let's move on now to something more familiar to us, and that is currency forwards and futures to wrap up this module. So currency forwards and futures, this is just one single transaction in the future to deliver out one currency and receive another in. Forwards, as we know, are OTC contracts, traded off exchange historically, whereas futures are exchange traded and centrally cleared. So there are a few comments here about the there's a few comments here about the mechanisms of these markets. The key thing is, though, both these contracts allow us to hedge exposure to a currency or a currency payment in the future. So if we have exposure to a currency between now and 3 months' time, maybe we can sell that currency forward. And if that currency does weaken and it hurts on some sort of spot underlying exposure that we've got, we've hedged it because we win under the futures or the forward contract. Now, currency forwards, being OTC, they're negotiable, tailored to participants' needs, customised, whilst currency futures, as we already know, the details of those contracts are set by the exchange that lists them, like ICE in Europe or CME in the States. That means actually futures contracts are unlikely to give us a perfect hedge because they're not necessarily likely to give us exactly the maturity date that we desire or the size that we desire. We might be rounding number of contracts, as we'll see. You can calculate a hedge ratio nice and easily for currency futures. All right, if you take a futures contract with a certain exposure, certain size, then, and you want to remove a certain amount of exposure in your portfolio, all you need to do is to take the amount of exposure that you want to remove on the top here and divide by essentially the exposure that you get through one contract. So it's a very simple idea. If you want to remove $1 million or if you want to remove €1 million, say, of exposure, then there's 100,000 euros per contract, then you're going to need 10 contracts. Let's have a look at a more detailed example, but not massively demanding. Consider a US firm that will receive 20 million euros in 90 days' time. Now that makes them long the euro because if the euro weakens between now and 90 days' time, the euros that we receive in by fewer dollars, and that causes an economic loss to the US firm. So they're long the euros because they know they're going to have them in the future. If they weaken, that's going to hurt them. So in order to hedge that, they're going to take an opposite position in the futures market. They're going to sell euros forward. So they agree to deliver out these euros and receive in the futures rate here. So it's $1.31, so 1.3150 dollars per euro. Now, you don't have to learn contract specifications for the exam because they usually tell you in the question. Here you're told that this particular FX future has a contract size of 125,000 euros. Okay, so every contract represents that amount. I think it's almost trivial calculating the hedge ratio here, so don't drop these marks. Take the exposure that you want to remove, which is the cash payment you're going to receive, divide by the exposure of one contract, and you come out here at 160 futures, which is a nice round number. Now, that means that essentially, through the futures hedge, you are agreeing to deliver out 20 million and receive in, that's 20 million euros, and receive in 20 million times $1.3150. That's $26.33 million. Just beware, you do want your maturity date on the contract to be very close to the date where the payment happens. If the futures settle before the euros are received, you will have exposure between that time and when the euros are received. And if the futures settle after the euros are received, the futures position will have to be closed prior to expiry, and there is some price risk on where you would close that position.